Hello and welcome to the Inside Intelligence webinar series, brought to you by the Master of Science in Intelligence Analysis program and the Johns Hopkins University Office of Advanced Academic Programs. Today's event features a discussion with Deborah Wituski on leadership analysis as an intelligence discipline. My name is Peter Huggins and I'm the event producer. Please note today's event will be recorded and uploaded to the AAP YouTube channel under the Inside Intelligence playlist. During the program, if you have any questions, please feel free to use the Q&A function and we'll answer as many questions as possible during the latter portion of the event. With that, I will turn over the event to our moderator, Dr. Michael Ard, Program Director and Senior Lecturer for the Master of Science in Intelligence Analysis program.
Thank you very much, Peter, and welcome everyone to Inside Intelligence today. We're very happy to have with us Deborah Wituski as our guest. She's the Vice President for Resilience and Risk Foresight at Google and is responsible for a global program that informs business decisions on risk analysis to protect Google's people, property, ideas. But prior to Google, she served in the U.S. government for 20 years, starting as a leadership analyst in Iraq for the Central Intelligence Agency. Deb went on to other positions working on the Middle East and counterterrorism issues and held senior positions, including Chief of Staff to the Director of CIA. Deb earned a Bachelor of Arts and Master of Arts degree in Political Science from West Virginia University and a PhD in Political Science from Ohio State University, and we welcome her to our program. Now, our discussion today is on leadership analysis, understanding a discipline, which maybe people don't realize that it is a discipline within the Director of Analysis. It's something of a bread and butter discipline, I think. I believe I read somewhere that leadership profiles were the most requested CIA products from policymakers. So this is a really good opportunity for us to discuss what leadership analysis is, how it's put together, what policymaker customers expect from it, and what have been some of the lessons learned from it over the years. So, Deb, what's some thoughts on how'd you get into leadership analysis?
First, Michael, thank you for having me. It's great to reconnect with you. And I'm always excited to talk about leadership analysis because I always tell folks that I'm still a recovering leadership analyst. I actually got into leadership analysis through serendipity. I was a graduate student at Kelly, I think got it right in the chat, the Ohio State University, and was studying political psychology as my minor and international relations as my major, really focusing on the importance of individuals in foreign policy decision-making, which, as you know, for all of us who have IR backgrounds, the two dominant theories in international relations are realism and liberalism, where the states are the actors. And so focusing on the individuals in the foreign policy arena was a contrast to the dominant strains of theory when I was in graduate school, and I presume still is today. And I supplemented my political science work with work in the social psychology department. Back then, Ohio State used to run a summer institute in political psychology, which government analysts would participate in. And in one of those summers where I was doing my teaching assistant job of organizing that 4-week program, there were some CIA analysts who participated. And they said, hey, you're studying this. You can do this for US policymakers. And you should apply. And I thought, like, how am I ever going to get in? This isn't really relevant. But I went through the process and was really fortunate to get a conditional offer of employment. And then started at the agency about a year later. And I was first assigned to the Iraq account. And not to date myself, but I think it's relevant for the history of what we'll talk about today. I started in the late 90s when Iraq was led by one family and really one person. And obviously through the course of my career as a leadership analyst, I watched the organization of Iraq's political system changed radically to a proliferation of political actors that had not been on the scene when I first started, focused on Saddam and his two sons and his closest inner circle. So as most things, I never intended to become a leadership analyst, but life has a way of throwing opportunities in your direction, and you just have to be willing to take a chance.
Let's go back to the discussion on Iraq and some of these other cases that you worked on. But first, let's talk a little bit about what are policymakers expecting out of leadership analysis from CIA?
So I think policymakers look to the agency to help them understand the person that's going to be sitting across the table from them, or the individual that they're going to be engaging in negotiations with, or now on a video call. Or, and this is a really interesting part, is they want to know adversaries. And sometimes we have to do that from a distance because we don't have relations with that country, or we don't have great collection in that space for whatever reason. But so they want to understand the perspective of the person. They want to be able to build rapport. They want to know their priorities. They want to possess insights on their strengths and weaknesses to potentially leverage any vulnerabilities to the advantage of U.S. interests. And so those insights can come in a variety of ways. Primarily, like most analysts, they come either in written form or in verbal form, in the form of a briefing to a policymaker, or in the form of a product that is delivered to a policymaker, either self-initiated by the analyst or requested by the policymaker.
Earlier, you mentioned to me about trying to understand leadership priorities, their strengths and weaknesses, but you also mentioned worldview, how a leader thinks about the world. Can you talk a little bit about that?
I think
that's
that. Yeah, and it's a great question. And I think that's where leadership analysts can be a lot more creative in terms of thinking about sources of information. I used to read Saddam's speeches that were translated to try to understand how he viewed issues that were happening in the world around him from his context, not from a Western definition of rationality or of how we view the world, but to ensure that we were thinking about the person in their particular context, their historical groundings, their education. So you can really get at that issue in a variety of ways. Obviously, what they say, where they're from, what their religious background is, where they were educated, what was the defining moment of their formative experience, whether it was 9/11 for many leaders in this country, a global pandemic for the next generation of leaders across the globe, but really being able to understand the person in the moment and how they were affected, what they were doing at the time of these major shocks in the geopolitical system. And so it is not a solo effort because you have to understand the context. So if you are looking at a political leader, you want to understand, how did the person first get exposed to politics? What was their first victory if they're a politician, or their first defeat, and what did they learn from that? How did they move up in the ranks? Did they have a patron? Were they part of a political machine in their respective countries? Now, political leaders is not the only type of leader that you have the opportunity to explore and research if you're a leadership analyst. Let's say you're really interested in the general, the key general who's the decision maker on national security. What battles or conflicts did that individual experience as they rose up in the ranks to senior leadership in the military? What staff college did they attend? What major events were happening in the political system that the military may or may not have been involved in? Right. We often used to talk about, in Saddam's case, when we talked about the generals that were around him in the late 90s, early 2000s, what positions did they hold during the Iran-Iraq War? What positions did they hold during the Persian Gulf War? And how did that shape their view of the adversary, meaning the United States?
Right. getting back to the earlier point about the new leaders that came. I mean, we had diplomatic relations with Iraq. I mean, we had state cables talking about meetings with Saddam Hussein. Right? When you don't, then later, of course, when he was deposed, removed from power, we had this new crop of leaders that came up. Right? Some of them were unknown to us. So what was the challenge then of finding out about people like, Aziz Hakim and people like Muqtada al-Sadr and others who then became extremely prominent, after the U.S. occupied Iraq?
I had been working Iraq for about 4 years at that point, and usually about the time where you would want to actually go do something different. But because the entire political landscape changed around me, I was fortunate enough to be able to stay on the Iraq account, but yet be exposed to a whole new series of leaders that we needed to understand to help policymakers advance U.S. interests in the country. And that wasn't just limited to political leaders. We had to think about an entire religious organization that we had very little visibility into, because the Shia in Iraq during Saddam's reign were very much underground, and leaders that were that raised the level of interest of Saddam usually met an undesirable fate, like Muqtada al-Sadr's own father.
Right.
And so we really needed to think about, what do we need to know about not just these new political actors, whether they were internal oppositionists where little was known, external oppositionists, who were their patrons on the external side, and then who were all of these key opinion formers that existed in the country that would exert influence on the political process that we basically didn't know. So really exciting time, but also a chance to be really creative and to learn about, again, where were these people educated? What were they doing the whole time while Saddam and his regime was in power? How did they manage to stay out of the limelight, but yet have a constituency that then they could tap into after his fall? And so it was a really fascinating time to watch a whole crop of individuals emerge and really create a very vibrant political dynamic where it had not existed before, that was dominated by a handful of folks.
One of the things about, as I recall, the leadership analysts doing their work, it seemed always they were very keen on getting feedback from customers, especially after meetings. Can you talk to that a little bit?
No, absolutely. I mean, one of the best resources and sources of information are people who actually sit in the room with leaders. It's one thing to observe somebody at a distance and to be able to read their speeches and consistently watch how they behave. But it's another thing to actually talk to somebody who's been in the room with them. How did they react? What were their mannerisms like? What issues appeared to be ones where they felt like really in command of the substance, and on other topics where they felt like, they read their talking points and kind of moved on, right? So that's the kind of granular information that really gives you insights into people that can help policymakers prepare for those types of engagements. Also, it gives you a sense of how they might behave in places when we're not, right? It gives you a track record of their behavior to be able to look back and say, okay, when we raised this issue, this was the reaction. So a similar issue may garner something like that reaction. So we can prepare for that by keeping the communication channels open, by how we might phrase talking points. So really actionable information that can help advance a policymaker's objectives for a meeting.
So there's a lot of give and take with policymakers on this. I mean, in terms of leadership analysis. Let's go back to another point you raised about, you're looking at leaders from afar in many cases. We're focusing oftentimes on sometimes leaders from hard target countries. So how do we collect on those types of individuals?
I lost you for a second after you said sometimes we're
looking at hard target countries.
There we
right?
go. Yeah.
So where we don't really have, maybe we don't have an embassy, we just don't have a very good collection. And, or these are organizations that are secret societies, essentially, like terrorist organizations.
So you have to think creatively, right? And you have to look and see what information do you have? Are there videos of meetings that the leader takes part in? Do the players around the table stay the same every meeting? Do they sometimes move seats? And is that something that indicates whether or not somebody's in or out of favor? What do their speeches say? What type of public appearances do they make? Are they military parades? Are they political rallies? Like, what are the nature of the events? Back in the 90s, Saddam used to go out and meet with all the tribes, right? And he partly was doing that to burnish his own credentials in the Tigriti tribe, but he also recognized that in the Sunni heartland, he needed to cultivate those relationships. And so the media would often cover him at these events. Now, on the face of it, you would think, why is Saddam going to these remote villages and meeting with the tribes? Well, because those tribes were pivotal to maintaining his power. And so understanding the power calculus and what segments of the society are a priority for the leader to cultivate to maintain power, because regardless of whatever leader you're focused on, the goal is to keep the seat, right? And so what type of constituencies does the leader need to engage in to ensure they keep the seat? And so we have to get creative. The other thing we need to do is you need to recognize that you're looking at the whole leader. And at times that means both the mental and the physical health of the leader. And so that's where partnership with clinicians and docs are really important, because they can give you a perspective on whether or not someone is behaving the way they are because they're sick or they are struggling with an issue. And so that's a really important relationship. As I said, leadership analysis doesn't take place in a vacuum. You need to partner with all of the other disciplines. And this is one where, in addition to understanding the military and economic and political context where the leader operates, understanding the individual, both from a clinical and a medical perspective, is really valuable. And that partnership is key. And there are examples in American foreign policy, most notably Iran, 1979, where we were missing a key point of information, which was that the Shah was very sick. And that really, I think, had an effect on our analysis at the time.
His French doctors knew it.
French doctor's the only one that knew.
Right. But the other thing, and that's a great example, because and maybe that example is one that changed the way the CIA's analysis looked at foreign leaders. Here's a case of where we really knew. I mean, we had a relationship with the Shah for many years, and yet there seemed to be a real misunderstanding of his character.
For sure. And I think also that based on all of the work that's been declassified associated with the Iranian Revolution, we didn't have a complete understanding of the Shah's standing in the country, and the support that key groups that he was losing as a result of the White Revolution in terms of the reforms that he was trying to make. And so I think that that partnership that was born out of that is just really important. And I have to say that Dr. Jerry Post really is the standard bearer on these issues. I mean, he really drove the U.S. government to think about how to integrate the medical and the psychology piece with the other elements of the analysis of individuals. And he really was the first. And Bruce Rydell at Brookings has a great article about the late Dr. Post and what an impact he had, starting as early as his work on Begin and Sadat, for the Camp David negotiations. And he was really one of the first that helped US policymakers understand Ayatollah Khomeini when he rose to power in the wake of the revolution in Iran in 1979.
By the way, everybody, put your questions in the Q&A function. I'm enjoying looking out of the corner of my eye on the chat, what's going on now. If you'll flag the question for me, we'll be getting to those in a few. I'm sure there'll be a lot of good ones. I think that the other, I was just thinking about how, sometimes we get at difficult leaders where somebody was raising, North Korea in the chat, and celebrities meet with on, and they come back, I'm sure they get debriefed.
Yeah, I would suspect that they do. I mean, I've been out of government now for several years. I would think that, insights from any type of engagement that we have, if it's possible, we certainly try to glean information from all of those. Now, look, people meet with people all the time, and sometimes they're not looking for the types of indicators that we would be looking for as analysts, right? And so those may or may not yield lots of results, but diplomats of countries that we interact with that have a relationship with an adversary of ours that we do not have a relationship with, those are actual, government officials who are looking for those kinds of things, so they may be a better source of information.
Right. One of the things, of course, congressional delegations oftentimes are extremely good resources for, and it's interesting too that some congressmen and women will develop relationships with foreign leaders that other that maybe our actual policymakers in the executive branch don't have. This was the case with Hugo Chavez, when there were certain congressional delegations that would go to meet with him all the time, including one representative who was a Republican from North Carolina, who in Congress had struck up a very good relationship with Chavez. And he, in fact, invited him back, and he visited his district. So when you get back to your question of creativity, you need to take advantage of and these relationships and see what insights you can get from them, and reach out, because I think that's a very important part of being a leadership analyst, is to take advantage of those type of
Agree. And it's interesting because I know much of the debate around the relationship between intelligence and policymakers. If you think back to Sherman Kent, it's about ensuring that there is a separation, that you can support, but yet you are at a distance. And people used to say there's a reason why there's a river between CIA headquarters and the rest of the buildings in Washington. But for leadership analysts, understanding the policymakers' priorities and then really ensuring that feedback loop is well developed is a critical way to be able to provide really useful insights that they can then use. And so I think that that's somewhere where I'm not suggesting that we analysts should be dictating, but we should be leveraging the relationship with the policymaker and the leader for those insights that then we can turn around, put them into the appropriate context for the policymaker, and then redeploy that information. So then they actually have the benefit of understanding, hey, we may have had this isolated case with this individual, but when I see it in a broader context that the analyst provided for me, I understand what their motivation was. I understand what they were trying to achieve by our engagement. I understand their perspective better. And so I think that's where the feedback loop is so critical between the policymaker and the analyst.
We decided beforehand, our ground rules for this is we can talk about adversaries of the U.S., right? We can talk about adversaries. We're not going to talk about friends or allies. But are there some? But perhaps we can at least allude to this. Are there some accounts where it's difficult to be a leadership analyst because the policymakers know so much about this account anyway, and the leaders?
Sure. I mean, I think that probably goes the same with people who work really hot accounts that have an interest by policymakers, whether it's because of particular interest in a country or because of an event or a war, an ongoing war. I do think that the analyst's responsibility is to still try to provide unique, actionable insights to the policymaker. And there is a bit of an expertise trap, right? You oftentimes, if you really feel like you know somebody, you're going to be able to explain away anomalies in their behavior because, hey, I've been meeting with this person for forever. Much like we do in life, right? With friends, we're easy to explain away friends' behavior, more so than when it's a stranger. And so I think what the value is that the analyst is still not in the room. So they are one step removed in most cases from these engagements. And I think that gives them an opportunity to check any biases, an opportunity to make sure that they think about their assumptions and they question their assumptions if the behavior is anomalous. I think it's easier to do that when you don't have a personal relationship with someone, but then telling the story back to the policymaker who has that relationship has to be done artfully and in a way that's grounded in either the data or the experience. Because just like the behavior itself, they'll quickly dismiss your analysis because you don't know the person like I know the person.
Right. Last question, and then we'll get to the questions from our audience. But do leadership analysts at CIA have theories that they work off of? You know, general theories about maybe generations and how different like we, you know, always talk about Generation X or the greatest generation, something. Is this work for leadership analysis? Can we glean some insight on characters from on this, or even when they were, or even like say the Assad brothers, you know, and where they were sort of in the lineup.
Right. So I think that I started my remarks regarding my background, where I was a bit of an anomaly because I focused on individuals in the foreign policy space. There are scholars who have dedicated their professional careers to focusing on individual leaders. Robert Jervis, Alexander George, Irving Janis, who coined the great term groupthink. Alexander George talked about an operational code, which is very much like you mentioned, worldview. Robert Jervis talked about perception and misperception in the leader's understanding of other actors' behaviors and in the international system. And I think, you know, we're never going to write that in a policy and a document that goes to a policymaker, but I think it's really important that there is an underpinning, there's a theoretical underpinning for the analytic work that leadership analysts do. Because I think it grounds them in a way that they're able then to refer to the insights from academia, where they've looked at this across cases, historical cases, and sometimes in the political psychology space, they've looked at it in an experimental environment. And I think that helps ground our understanding of these concepts, which I think is really valuable in terms of introducing greater rigor to our analysis and greater structure. And, you know, when you're talking about human behavior, when you can apply rigor and structure, you're ahead.
Okay, great. Let's talk about go to a few of our questions. Now we have a lot of good ones. From Stephanie, knowing your function, other leadership analysts you work with, what type of person makes for a good leadership analyst in your view? And you were an analyst and you were a manager of analysts, Jeb. Yep. So you have a very good insight into this.
Oh, thank you.
What do you think people who bring it all together, what do you think their qualities are?
So thanks, Stephanie, for the question. I actually, in preparing for this, and I was really excited to revisit my history as leadership analyst, I talked to one of my former colleagues and I said, how would you describe those analysts who are better suited to leadership analysis? And their response was, if you gravitate towards having more biographies on your bookshelf than books about conflict or military doctrine, then you're more likely to kind of be partial to the work you do as a leadership analyst. And I think that's exactly right. I think you have to have an intellectual curiosity about leaders, about how leaders drive action for a country, recognizing sometimes there are external forces that mute the role of the role of the individual, but there are times where you can clearly see that the individual's preferences and priorities are shining through. And so I would say you have to be curious about people.
Yeah, there's I think curious about people too, and it seems to me you have to have, I'll just add this, a real fascination with cultural clues and the cultural environment that people come from. I'll offer this example, which I thought was stunning from my experience with Venezuela. We were looking at a picture of Hugo Chavez when he was president. We were still trying to figure Chavez out. This was back around, over 20 years ago. And he was talking to a religious group in Venezuela. And a friend of mine looked at the picture and immediately said, "That's a Tau cross he has around his neck." And the significance of that is that this was a group of Franciscans. So who were in this was a group in a secular order of Franciscans. So Chavez knew what symbol would resonate with them because that's their cross. They use that, right? And then it occurred to me that this is a man of political skills of a very high order. He's not the sort of blowhard that we kind of Americans had seen him as. He was a very subtle operator, and he could use these cultural clues with great effect. And they spoke to Venezuelans in different groups in different ways. It just struck me that I didn't recognize it, but he did. And so looking at other people can also bring a lot to the table when it comes to leadership analysis, strikes me.
Go ahead. You'd mentioned Bashar, you'd mentioned the Assad brothers before, right? Basil was the successor and then was killed in a car accident. And no one really knew much about Bashar other than he'd been educated in London. And he was an ophthalmologist. So we thought, well, clearly he's been exposed to Western ideals. He started a computer club, a computer society. So he was interested in technological advancement. And so I think people had high expectations that there had been more Western influence on Bashar early in his formative years. And, clearly it didn't change the fact that when his power was threatened, he was able to exercise every tool available to him to ensure that the Assad regime stayed in power in Syria.
But not somebody who one would expect necessarily would have survived as long as he has.
Right.
I mean, that's kind of, in fact, that gets back to another, Venezuela story. Nobody expected Maduro, who's about to be in power longer than Chavez was himself, to have lasted as long as he was with his background. There was a great deal of underestimation of his political skills. And that's something that, we learn probably over time. But let's say I go to another question. Does a leadership analysis always extend into the true intelligence domain and suggest probable leadership actions and directions so advantageous action can be taken to counter their efforts? In other words, is there opportunity analysis?
Exactly. Yes. That's exactly where I was going with this, Michael. I think that when the data allows for the analyst to provide opportunity analysis, a topic that will resonate, a issue that will be a great icebreaker when you're building a relationship, a insight regarding how the leader's inner circle feels about a particular topic that would give us leverage in a negotiation scenario, for instance. I think the analyst absolutely includes that. It is even more important to make sure that you have buttoned up that analysis, because this is likely to be deployed in a one-on-one or potentially a group setting. And so you really want to make sure that if you're offering opportunity analysis to the policymaker, that you have that you've kicked the tires on that.
The another question, and this is kind of this is a broader macro question, right? So over your career, have you picked up on any interesting shifts in how leaders operate on the global stage? Has this influenced any strategies or advice that leadership analysts can give?
So I have to say that I think I've learned intellectual patience over my career in watching leaders, and not automatically jumping to the plausible explanation. Here at Google, I lead a team that's focused on a lot of the geopolitical developments and what does it mean for the company. And at the beginning of the war, the invasion of Ukraine, I said to my analysts, we just need to keep asking ourselves, is there something that Vladimir Putin knows that we don't know? I'm not suggesting he's sick. I'm not suggesting that, there's a coup around him, but we have to question our own assumptions. Is there something that he knows that we don't know that could be driving the timeline, that could be driving the decision-making? Because I've learned that over time, you don't have the complete picture. You have an assumption that usually informs that first initial decision or first initial perspective on the action. And I just want us to kind of slow down, take a look at all of the information, look at it from multiple perspectives, and recognize that some of the information takes some time to develop, just like it probably took for the person to come to the decision itself. And so I think if I've learned anything, is that piece. And the second piece is we really need to be careful about applying a Western definition of rationality. There were many people in just Western media, as well as in the US government, that believed Saddam was crazy. And I believe Saddam operated in the context of the power structures that he was socialized into. That is not me being an apologist for all of the horrible things that he did to the Iraqi population during his regime, but I think this is how he understood power, and this is how he understood how to stay in power. And he saw a threat from Iran, and we learned this from his debriefings and what has been declassified from the debriefings, that he always saw the Iranians as the bigger threat. Right. And so his actions related to Iraq WMD and the great bluff of having WMD was never directed at the United States. It was directed at Iran. So the other lesson that I've learned is that, we often think that every other country, their behavior can be explained about how they think about their relationship with the United States. Sometimes we're not the most important show in town. And that's often really hard to think about, given our presence and our interests globally. But oftentimes local issues may take precedent, and we need to remember that.
All right, that's a great point. Let's go to another question, which is a little more institutional. How has the approach to analysis changed from pre 9/11 to post 9/11? So we both overlapped that period. What would you say about that?
So obviously, pre 9/11, the intelligence community was not focused predominantly on the counterterrorism enterprise. And post 9/11, even if you were a regional analyst, you had to think about the terrorist angle post 9/11. And I think it really did, it permeated how we thought about threat. And what I mean by that is that as a leadership analyst before 2001, I never really gave much thought to threats because I was focused on individuals, and I was focused on how the individuals were affecting government behavior. But after 9/11, threats, and particularly how a government or a leader viewed the United States, and what their language looked like with regard to threatening language of to the United States. That became a whole new area which we needed to pay greater attention to, and for all the right reasons, in the wake of the horrific terrorist attacks in our country. But I think that we incorporated that dimension much more intentionally to our overall look at the entire, how the government was behaving. Were they supporting terrorists? What were their relationships with terrorist groups like? Did they allow them safe haven in their countries?
Yeah, that was the window. And, sort of encapsulated in the phrase, well, global war on terrorism, and then, the other coverage, right? All right, what are we going to do about the rest of the stuff? And looking for global coverage was the phrase that was used. Everything else, seemed like the pace was also faster too. I wonder if there wasn't much. I wonder if we were lost with the sort of the first customer current approach. Maybe the chance to sit back and think about the big picture was a little bit diminished. I don't know. But anyway, yeah, that was a good question. What about historic examples from the region, Deb? I mean, you focused on the Middle East largely. Do you look back at from, say, leadership in countries like Egypt and Israel as for examples, as models for leadership analysis?
I think we can learn from historical examples. The challenge is to ensure that you're not applying and making the assumption that just because Nasser behaved this way, that means that Sisi is going to behave this way, because they live in a different time. Egypt is in a different standing with regard to the Arab nations, and so you like, I think you can inform your institutional knowledge of how leaders who have operated in this ecosystem previously, how they've structured their choices and how they've engaged with in relationships, whether bilaterally or multilaterally, because the leader you're looking at is looking back at history too, right? And they're also thinking about what's their legacy, because I'm going to be compared to people like Nasser and Sadat. So you have to understand the background. The challenge, of course, is that you don't allow the background to be weighted too heavily in the here and now.
What about, let's talk about unpredictability in leaders. So Kelly asks about another Buckeye, by the way. He asked about the, how do we predict this? Or can we predict it in certain leaders where they just appear to be acting chaotically?
So, I do an exercise with my class where I ask them to think about how are you going to think about a vacation you want to take next year, right? And then ask them, how hard was that? And you're just like, oh gosh, I don't know what I'm going to be doing. Like, I don't know what the timing is going to be like. Am I going to be able to take leave from work? I don't know what my family situation is going to be. I was like, okay, now try to predict when the person next to you is going to take vacation. And they're just like, oh, I have no idea. Right. And because I don't know what their priorities are, I don't know what. And so when you think about, like, you have a hard time projecting your own behavior. Right. And so try to do it for somebody else who also, you're probably doing it from a distance. Really challenging analytic question. And so what you can do is you can say, what are the factors that will feed into that decision? And if you can identify the factors, then you can actually look for information to give you an indication of where the person sits on those factors. That'll help inform. I wish I had a crystal ball. I wish every leadership analyst had a crystal ball. But the best that we can do is kind of understand how the person views the world. And maybe if we're really good, how they weigh those factors on their decision making. And if we know that putting the country first is the single most important thing in all of the decisions that they make, well, that'll help us narrow the decision space. And that's usually, like, if you can narrow the decision space to a set of, a spectrum, then that's really, that's valuable for the policymaker, because the decision space could be like this. So just narrowing it adds value to how they inform that engagement.
Perhaps we're too focused on the predictive here, and just,
Right.
and getting, maybe it's just best you can do is try to get, narrow that down for the policymaker. After all, I mean, Putin could have decided not to invade.
That's right.
I mean, that was certainly, and we would have looked back at that and said, well, we would have had a lot of good reasons why he made that decision too.
And none of them may have actually been the real reason.
Right, right. Okay, let's get a few more questions. And Pamela asked the importance of human intelligence and sources in this. How would you rank it in all the sources that go into leadership analysis?
So
And
I think
take it this means like formal human intelligence.
right. I mean, look, if you have a well-placed source that has firsthand access and is describing how an individual behaves and how they are a decision maker, that's gold. That's really hard to do, particularly for hard targets, because you are actually, that means you have successfully recruited someone in the individual's inner circle. And if you just think about how hard that would be to do in the United States, you understand how challenging it would be for U.S. intelligence to be able to achieve that level. Not impossible, but really, really challenging. I mean, the best information is information that is firsthand, whether it's connected or collected from a human source or from a technical source. But at the end of the day, what people say, can either be coded or can be, they can be obfuscating or they can lie, right? Whether they're doing it to somebody's face or they're doing it over electronic communication. And so I think that's why it's important to never rely on just one source of information and be able to corroborate that information based on other sources, whether it's, technical, human, open source, diplomatic reporting. I mean, I think the best sourcing on an individual is when you can actually corroborate through multi-ints.
Right. What about, how do we, as Jordan asked about leadership analysts, how do they mitigate their own biases in looking at leaders?
Right. I mean, I think not unlike all analysts who have to think about their own biases, use of structured analytic techniques, I think is a really powerful one. I think also having somebody who is a leadership analyst that is not an expert on the country that you are following or on the individual that you are following. Hey, check my rigor here, check my tradecraft. Are there things here that I make assertions that I do not support with the data? And that's where, like, the coordination process is so important, though at times so painful for analysts, because it really does help instill rigor in the process and gives you the benefit of other perspectives. So, okay, maybe you've never worked the Middle East, but boy, you've worked hard targets in North Korea, and there's something about authoritarian leaders that transcends culture that we can apply. And have you thought about this? And that's a great widening of the aperture for your perspective.
Another question about, and Henry, I think that answers your question too about biases and how and tools and techniques that are used in that. Very similar to what political analysts would use in many ways. Kelsey asked about all right, so how far back do you think it's valid to look at a leader? Going back to childhood relationships, family relationships, how does that fit into their, how does that resonate? Is there sort of a rosebud moment with some of these leaders, if you know what I'm getting at, where that's something that drives them that nobody knows about?
I go as far back as we possibly can. And on Saddam, we understood that Saddam's father wasn't in the picture, that his mother actually tried to abort Saddam, that she then remarried, had 3 sons. So he had 3 stepbrothers that were really pivotal at different times of his leadership rule, and formed kind of part of that inner circle and fell in and out of favor. And so I think that's really valuable to understand an individual's kind of like where they came from and how they're grounded in their family, what role they played. I mean, sometimes that information is not available, or it's romanticized because of the cult of personality around the leader. But I think it's, I think that information could be useful in understanding the person that you have in front of them. Whether it's because they tend to go to a particular location or they recognize a key constituency. I think all of that has the potential for insight. Just like all of us, there are things that happen to us that we probably don't think about on a regular basis in our formative years, but they probably shape how we engage on particular issues. I know we've got some Buckeyes on the call. Being at Ohio State, it definitely drives my preferences on Saturday afternoons for college football. Always happy to see the team in blue fall to whoever they're playing. And that's born of my experience of being a student at Ohio State. And so, I mean, I think that there are parts of people's backgrounds that are relevant that we may discount if we don't actually, like, at least intentionally consider it.
Let's talk about, Gordon asked, and there's something, let's see if we can get this. How do you distinguish between the soft skills of a leader, their ability to influence or manipulate people, then with their, say, personal convictions? And Gordon used as an example, say, Putin's way, he deals with individuals on one level and then deals with like national iconic issues like the Orthodox Church. Is there, how do we see are these leaders more balanced? Are they're stressing one over the other? How do we look at that?
Yeah, I think it's a great question. And it's one of the more challenging aspects of being a leadership analyst, because you don't know how much is for the stage and how much is the person. And when you have somebody who's in power for a long time, that gives you a lot of iterations to look at these issues, which could give you insights. The other thing is that I think, is it a power base that is key to the person's staying in the seat, as I said? And I think the Orthodox Church is in the Putin example, is a great case where that is a terrific institution to help bolster Putin's standing with the Russian population. And so thinking about things in terms of not just whether or not there's a shared set of beliefs, but also is there a political expediency and benefit to the relationship for the leader? I think you have to consider both. You have to look at their written and verbal statements on issues to know what's in some, like you always say as a leadership analyst, avoid in the heart and in the head words. Mm-hmm. You don't know what somebody's thinking. You only know what they do. You don't know what somebody desires. You only know how they articulate their priorities. And so staying away from the head and heart words is a challenge, but is important to think about because they could be doing it for manipulative purposes too. Right.
Is there a role here for more sort of speculative analysis? Like I remember there was some model paper. What keeps X up at night type, sure. These types of things. I think they had some resonance with policymakers, but is there some room for to be more speculative about that on what they're thinking?
I think for sure. And I think using a structured analytic technique like the one you mentioned is the way to convey that, because you want to say, look, this is plausible, a what if scenario. Mm-hmm. A contrarian technique like devil's advocacy. Those are all really useful as a way to structure the low probability, high impact scenarios, but in a way that says, look, we can identify indicators where this actually isn't that far off of like the trajectory if we're looking at it in a really structured way. But I think the challenge is to ensure that people know that this is a contrarian view.
Couple more questions. We also have a sort of a Google question, so I'll save that for last.
Okay.
What about okay, so the eternal sort of questions about human nature, did this come up? I mean, how do we see people? Are they good? Are they bad? Or do we have more of a mix? I mean, how does this fit into leadership analysis?
Yeah, I mean, I think this is where Jerry Post was so great, is that, look, whether we like or dislike a leader, we still have to understand them and potentially work with them. And so it is to our advantage to understand all aspects of the person, to include their mental and physical health. And look, it's not easy, and particularly not easy if you're doing it from a distance. But I do think that, labeling someone as inherently good or bad, that poses a challenge to your, checking your biases, right? Because a leader isn't bad if they believe they're operating in consistent with their interests. It might be bad for U.S. interests, but we also have to understand that there may be reasons why the person is behaving in that way that are local, driven by local considerations, and not by how the U.S. is going to react to them.
Right. Identifying emerging leaders. People who are, how do you look at that? What kind of the clues are you looking for?
Yeah. A really fun aspect of this, and a lot of the fun post Operation Iraqi Freedom, where we had to identify leaders that were coming out of the Iraqi landscape that we did not know about before the fall of Saddam. I think it's looking at who's attracting crowds, looking at who's now writing in the op-eds, looking at who gives the endorsement speeches at presidential campaign rallies, or at the conventions, if they have conventions, like where are people being cultivated? Looking at young parliamentarians who are, creating a splash in their respective legislatures, and they're garnering a broader national following. Looking at governors or really charismatic military leaders who won a big battle and then got a big promotion. And so, I mean, just really, like, that gets to the point of really knowing the country that you are following and understanding the context about who does the society hold up as heroes or heroines.
I'm sure that in your new role at Google, in this position in risk analysis, your background as a leadership analyst has been extremely important and valuable to you. But what about, like, where is strategic intelligence, say, in the private sector? Now you've had a chance to see it. How does this resonate with your customer base at Google? Do you find that it's easy to get them to understand, say, strategic intelligence the way that we used to use it in the government? So
I would say two things, because I know we're running up on time. The first thing I would say is that the private sector intelligence community has really evolved tremendously to a place where you can actually build an intelligence career within the private sector without ever having served in government. And I would say that wasn't the case 7 to 10 years ago, but it really has developed. And I would say, if you are at a private sector company in an intel shop and you can directly say why the intelligence matters to the company, here at Google, I coined the phrase, what's the Google so what on that? So it's not just about the geopolitical shock to the system. It's about how the geopolitical shock impacts this company, our people, and our properties in 64 countries globally. And so I think if you can sharpen your focus to really identify the insights that are relevant to the company that you work, that your customers pay attention.
Thank you very much, Deb. Thanks for that. And so many great answers to our questions today. And by the way, to the audience, wonderful engagement in the chat, and also your questions on this interesting topic. Thanks for being with us. We hope we can do this again soon, Deb. And good luck over at Google and your own teaching. And just wanted to let everybody know in the audience that we will be having another Inside Intelligence with Rennie Babiarts, one of our faculty members, talking about GeoInt and its use in tracking China's current nuclear program. So join us then. That'll be on November 15th. So with that, I'd like to thank everybody for joining us today, and thank our guest, Deborah Wituski, and hope to see you all soon.
Thank you, Michael.